art gallery. He was an artist, and asked a friend to bring some bikes in just to kind of, you know, sort of, he was looking for a certain kind of air in the gallery, decided he was more taken with the bikes and the art on the wall, and started crafting just these beautiful but very practical bikes. And so that's one thing that you're starting to see. But most, I got to tell you, I spent an afternoon wandering around just talking to people, and I don't think I talked to a single one of them who got really excited about bikes. In fact, a more typical conversation was a woman I talked to in college, rides her bike every day, totally fine with it. And, you know, and I said, well, do you want to get a car one day? And boy, her face just lit up. She was really excited about that. And then she had, well, of course I wouldn't drive in the city. That's stupid. Why would I really do that? And then, you know, but about the bike, she just kind of shrugged and said it's a tool, you know. And I mean, it's like getting, you know, it's like me wandering down around the Pearl District asking people about their toasters. You know, I mean, this is, you know, that's kind of how commonly they take it. You know, yeah, right.
I rode in Manhattan for 20 years. So
all right.
It's a thrill of it. What do you think would be the impetus for the rest of the country? Will it be the expense, the environmental reasons, the health reasons, to get everyone riding?
Well, I don't think you're going to get everyone riding, because, you know, one thing that's intriguing about this as a form of transportation is it really has to be something you want to do. You know, in fact, Paul Steely-White, the executive director of Transportation Alternatives, the main bike group in New York, you probably know that group. I was talking to him one day, and he said, you know, I wonder what it's going to be like if we get up to 25% mode share. You're going to see people ride to work, you know, just kind of grumpy like you see most commuters today. And I think the reality is that they won't. But I think enough people will find, I mean, it really is something you don't do unless you love it. And then you start finding other reasons maybe why you want to do it. But I think if you make it a safer and a more efficient choice than it often is today, I think that's going to encourage a lot more people to ride. Yeah, Stephanie.
Have you seen any basic ingredients of increased bike traffic that you could, like, what's the primordial ooze of increased bike mode share?
The primordial ooze. Well, I mean, it's a big theme of my book, and that is safety in numbers. I mean, I just had that driven home again and again and again. You know, this guy Peter Jacobson down in Sacramento who did some pioneering studies. I think it was, if I'm remembering correctly, it was the city of Pasadena went to him and said, well, are we having a large number of bike crashes or not? I mean, is this safe for bicycling or not? And he really dug into Pasadena's statistics and also compared them to several other cities in the state and said, well, yes, you do have more bike crashes, but you have a heck of a lot more bike traffic. And in terms of, you know, sort of a percentage base, it's actually much safer in Pasadena. And that got him kind of thinking. And he eventually realized that there really was almost this mathematical formula that he could come up with, you know, where it went like this. And as the number of cyclists went up, the crash rate literally went down. And I just, you know, once I sort of, even before I learned it, but certainly once I learned it, everywhere you go, you just see the examples. I'll give you one tiny example. I was up in Seattle one day on the Burke-Gilman Trail, which is sort of their famous bicycle facility up there. It runs through north part of Seattle past University of Washington. And at several points, the trail intersects streets, you know, kind of mid-block, sort of like parts of the Springwater corridor do. And it was striking to me how often motorists would stop when they kind of reached mid-block, even though there wasn't necessarily a lot of signage or anything, but they had just been trained through all those years that, you know, they had to be careful when they were there. And they wouldn't have shown that same care, I'm convinced, unless it was a daily occurrence where they saw a lot of bikes. I mean, as Peter Jacobson puts it, there's a strong dose response from motorists. I mean, I see it, I don't know if you all will disagree with me, but I see it in Portland. I mean, I see a different dose response from motorists now than 10 or 20 years ago. I'm convinced of it. Way in the back.
Yeah, I grew up in New Jersey, so I rode there a lot. It's funny here, people will stop when they don't have a stop sign. I have a stop sign, they don't, a motorist. And, you know, I'm stopped at the stop sign, they're stopped, I'm telling them to go. They're telling me to go.
Yeah.
It's kind of confusing, it's nice, but...
That's famous Portland passive aggressiveness. Yeah, great.
So can you talk a little bit about kind of the impact that the vehicular cycling movement has had on our ability to create bicycle transportation systems in our country?
Yeah, that's an interesting story. Let me explain about vehicular cycling a little bit. I mean, I think the term itself was invented by a guy named John Forrester, who is, you could write a whole book about him. I mean, he's this fascinating kind of Shakespearean figure who has been, well, God, how do I even start to get into John Forrester? He became kind of active, and he'd been bicycling ever since he was a kid in England. His family moved to the United States. In fact, his father was the novelist C.S. Forrester, who did, you know, the Horatio Hornblower novels and everything. And John became an engineer, cycled, you know, recreation in the 50s and 60s, and was very much taken with British cycling magazines and the way they did it. And when some city, he happened to be living in Powell, or riding through Palo Alto at the time when Palo Alto started trying to do some bikeways, and he vociferously protested. He became very active in the bike movement, ended up writing, among other things, a book called Effective Cycling. And his whole attitude was that bicyclists fare best when they ride as a motor, or treated as a motor vehicle, and ride as much as possible in that fashion. And in fact, most cyclists, I mean, that get accomplished this, I mean, you do vehicular cycling. I mean, you know, it's a smart way to ride. But Forrester is this is the Shakespearean part of it. I mean, he's just given to these big rages. Anybody who disagreed with him, you know, it just met with streams of invective. He showed me this huge 2-volume biography, self-published, of his father, you know, like 800 pages, because he's trying to work on all these conflicts of childhood, because apparently C.S. Forrester was not a nice man, at least not to his family. And so he really, very much in the 70s, I'm sorry, a long way around to get to your point, in the 70s he really did play a role in discouraging a lot of municipalities from doing things that they ended up doing in the 90s, you know, following Davis's lead and doing bike lanes and things like that. And he, at one time, headed the League of American Wheelmen. You know, they had sort of epic, you know, like the Trotskyites and the Leninists, you know, all these fights and everything. And still, there are still a lot of people who follow his precepts, and I've seen him occasionally in Portland. I remember a meeting one time at City Hall when, after those very tragic crashes, remember they started putting in the bike boxes, and I remember this one guy started explaining why those were really horrible things, and you know, he was a vehicular cyclist. So not everybody is unified in that, and there still is a part of that. But one thing I pointed out in the book, it was really evident by the time I started doing my research, that his point of view had really been eclipsed and long since passed away. But he's, you know, although he didn't respond to my email recently. I hope he's okay, but he is getting fairly old now, and there are other people who are active who still kind of have a lot of that attitude. One thing that's interesting about Forrester is he never really thought that it was reasonable to assume that a lot of people would cycle. You know, he would tell you that the only reason that cycling has increased in Portland is because a bunch of young people moved here and young people cycle. And, you know, he hasn't really been to Portland, but he doesn't need to be because he's a really smart guy. And in fact, he's never been to the Netherlands either, and he has lots of critiques of that too, which I found interesting. But I mean, he's a really interesting guy, and he has had an effect. The one thing that I think a lot of longtime bike advocates would agree, sort of the one thing that they broadly agree that he did, he really did a good job of arguing that cyclists have the right to the road. That, you know, there could have been a period in the late 60s, early 70s when there could have been a movement to really say cyclists cannot ride on these roads. You know, in other words, that much more, you know, like oftentimes